Buddha and Jesus, 4 crucial differences. You've probably heard someone like Oprah or even the Dalai Lama say that all religions teach the same thing. Often they'll even go further and they'll say Jesus and Buddha taught the exact same message of peace, non-attachment, and inner transformation. As popular as this story is, it's completely wrong. Jesus and Buddha could not have been more different. The story that Buddha and Jesus gave the same message, it might feel good. You might find it really comforting. But the reason it's comforting is because it doesn't require you to make a commitment one way or the other. But here's the problem. Neither Jesus or Buddha is trying to make you feel comfortable, nor are they trying to save you from having to make a real decision and a real commitment. Jesus and Buddha are offering serious solutions to the most fundamental problems of human existence. And here's the thing. Their solutions point in different directions. So to actually adopt a solution, you have to make a decision, either enlightenment or hope. And you can't do both. You have to choose one or the other. So in this video, I'm going to show you 4 crucial differences between the teachings of Jesus and Buddha that the pluralists are hiding from you, or maybe they don't even know. There's the issue of suffering, of salvation and death. There's even the issue of family and whether or not having a family is a hindrance to salvation. But let's start with the idea of kingship. All right, so becoming a king in the ancient world is about the most spectacular and glorious achievement imaginable. The Gospel of Matthew traces Jesus' lineage back to King David to establish a royal pedigree. So how did Jesus and Buddha respond to the prospect of becoming king? All right, well, we'll start with Buddha. Buddha rejected kingship. So in the most common origin stories, Buddha is the son of a king, and when he's born, there's this prophecy. And the prophecy is that the child, his name is Siddhartha, Siddhartha is either going to grow up to be a world monarch, a king of kings, a lord of lords, or he's going to grow up to become enlightened, which is what Buddha means. Buddha means enlightened one. Now, there's a condition on this prophecy. He's going to become a world monarch so long as he never sees 3 things before the age of 30, right? That's someone who is old and decrepit, someone suffering from disease, and death. As long as he doesn't see these things, he'll be a world monarch. So his father, who's a king, obviously wants Siddhartha to grow up to be a king. He takes every step imaginable to make sure that Siddhartha never sees these sights. He puts him in a palace with high walls and doesn't allow any old or sick people in there. So Siddhartha grows up in this world where he is sheltered from death, from disease, from suffering, even from old age. He gets married, he even has a son. But in a story like this, you know what's going to happen. Eventually, he gets curious. He sneaks outside of the palace walls, and that's when he encounters the sights. First, he sees an old man, bent over, stooped in old age. Then he sees someone suffering from a horrible disease. Finally, he sees a corpse. Upon seeing these 3 sights, he is shaken, right? He goes into existential despair, and he realizes he's got to leave his family and find an answer. All right, so hang on right there. Now, you might be thinking, why? Why does he have to leave everything behind because of seeing these 3 things? We'll get to that when we talk about the Buddhist ideal of salvation. So what Buddha does is he forsakes his royal status. He does not remain in the palace. Instead, he becomes a wandering renunciate. He actually sees a renunciate, and he realizes he needs to follow them and follow their lifestyle to try to find enlightenment. Now, renunciates at this time, they practiced an ascetic lifestyle, a lot of fasting. It was very harsh, very difficult, and they go off alone and they spend a lot of time meditating. Now, Siddhartha realizes that the renunciates don't have the answers he's looking for, but he goes and he meditates, and while in deep meditation, he achieves enlightenment. However, even though he achieves enlightenment and gets the answers he's looking for, he doesn't go back to the palace. He doesn't go back to rule as a king. So we can say definitively, Buddha rejects kingship. This is going to be very different from Jesus. Jesus' ministry is actually all about bringing a kingdom. If you look at the Gospels carefully, most of what Jesus is doing is announcing the coming of a kingdom. Most of Jesus' teaching is about how that kingdom is going to arrive. Who's in, who's out, what do you have to do to join it? One of the major features of Jesus' ministry are healing the sick and exorcisms, and these are contextualized by Jesus as inaugurating or advancing his kingdom. In fact, one theme you'll see in the Gospels is Jesus goes around testing people, including teachers of the law, priests, and what he's doing is he's testing them to see whether or not these servants have been faithful in the absence of the king. All right, so I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking, but wait, Jesus' kingdom, that's a metaphor, right? That's a metaphor for something spiritual. He doesn't mean a literal kingdom, right? All right, well, it's true. Jesus doesn't exercise any political power during his ministry, but he does promise that there's going to be a second coming. And at the second coming, Jesus is going to come very differently. He's going to come in glory, majesty, and power. Jesus is going to return. There's going to be a judgment, and he's going to reign forever. So Jesus is going to return to rule as a King of Kings and a Lord of Lords. And Christians actually look forward to this second coming and the full manifestation of this kingdom. So now you have to be thinking, all right, so why wouldn't Buddha choose to rule as an enlightened king? Wouldn't Buddha ruling as an enlightened king make the world a better and more just place? Stay tuned until the end, and when we unpack the idea of salvation for both Jesus and Buddha, then we'll have the answer. It'll help if we talk about difference number 2, family, right? Family is everything, right? You never choose against the family, right, Fredo? In the Gospels, Jesus says you have to hate your family for his sake, and he talks about people leaving their family for the sake of the kingdom. On the other hand, in Buddha's origin story, he abandons his family. All right, so what's going on here? Is having a family a hindrance to salvation or not? We're going to see 2 very different answers. In fact, Buddha rejects family as a hindrance to salvation. In the story, Buddha doesn't return home. He doesn't resume married life. He renounces family. In fact, in the story, he does go home kind of to say goodbye, but he just kisses his wife and baby on the cheek, and then he leaves. Now, whether or not this Buddha origin story is authentic, it does reflect early Buddhism. Early Buddhism is monastic, and it requires renouncing marriage and family. So for the first few centuries of Buddhism, everyone was a monk, and you could not have a wife and children. And the reason for this is that familial bonds are seen as impediments to reaching enlightenment. All right, so now you got to be wondering, well, what on earth is enlightenment, and why would having a family hinder achieving it? And let's go back to Jesus and Jesus' sayings about how you have to leave your family behind. What's going on there? All right, so how do we understand Jesus' teachings on the family? Well, first, it's not a general requirement. Remember, they're going around, they're preaching the gospel to all sorts of people, and they're not telling people to abandon their families. The call to leave everything behind is specifically for the disciples. In fact, if you go further in the New Testament, you can see that this is really temporary. Later on, we see that the apostles live with their wives. And so the way to understand this is they're really on a special mission. Think about a kingdom and think about why you might have to leave your family behind to serve a kingdom. The most obvious answer is for military service. So think of them as like on a military campaign. You wouldn't bring your family, your wife and your children along on a dangerous military campaign, would you? Right? When the American GIs, when they go overseas to fight the Germans or the Japanese, they don't bring their families with them. Now, Jesus does have teachings about family and kingdom, and he does emphasize that the kingdom has higher allegiance. And so if it does create division in the family, you choose the kingdom. But when the family as a whole are believers, the family is not erased. And it probably helps. Remember, Jesus' first public miracle is he blesses a wedding at Cana. Jesus also affirms teachings of honor your father and your mother. And he actually teaches against dissolving marriages and severing that bond. Jesus actually uses the language of the husband leaving his family and cleaving to his wife. So this is the language of a strong bond, a union. Furthermore, Jesus says this union is authored by God. He says, what God hath joined, let no man separate. So if the marital union is authored by God, marriage is not a hindrance to salvation. So we need to figure out what salvation is. This gets us to difference number 3, death and salvation. When it comes to the problem of death and the afterlife, we'll see the real difference emerge between Jesus and Buddha. So now it's going to get real. Is death an enemy to overcome, an enemy to strive against, an enemy to conquer? Or is death something that we make peace with, something that we learn to accept? So we'll start with Jesus. Jesus sees death as an enemy to conquer. The Gospels lead up to the resurrection. That's the climax. And that represents the final defeat of death. And in fact, he promises resurrection and eternal life to his followers. And really, just look at Jesus' ministry. What does he do? He goes around healing people. He even goes around raising people from the dead. You'll see this theme of death as an enemy, especially in the Gospel of John, where a tremendous amount of space is devoted to explaining how Jesus gives eternal life. The resurrection is a permanent triumph over death. Death's the enemy. The key to this kingdom is it's a kingdom of eternal life. You can't reign forever if you're dead. So the Christian idea of salvation is bound up with the idea of death as an enemy, something to be overcome, and the solution is eternal life that Jesus gives. Buddhism, on the other hand, sees death as an unchangeable fact of existence. And this really gets into the idea of impermanence. Buddhist enlightenment, it's all about understanding death as an unchanging fact. So Buddha teaches the three marks of reality: suffering, impermanence, and non-self. And they're connected. Nothing is permanent. Everything dissolves. There's not even a permanent self. The reason that you suffer is because you're trying to hold on to things that are not going to last, including yourself. Realizing non-self is the key to avoiding suffering. That is, suffering comes from a desire for permanence. So realizing that that's not an option, realizing that you're impermanent and everything else in the world is impermanent too, that's the key to enlightenment. When you no longer are trying to hold on to these things, that's what liberates you from suffering. So what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is realizing your own impermanence and the impermanence of everything else. It's accepting death as an unchangeable fact. And if you accept this fact, then you no longer have to suffer because you won't be trying to hold on to things. All right, so eternal life? Well, that's going to contradict all three marks of reality. It means there's a permanent self, it doesn't have to die, and that life can be good and not permeated by suffering. Buddhists know all about being born again. They have a doctrine of reincarnation. But here's the thing, they're not trying to be reincarnated. If you achieve enlightenment, reincarnation stops and death becomes permanent. So on a Buddhist perspective, resurrection makes absolutely no sense. In fact, there are spiritual movements from the East that encounter Christianity. And what do? They deny the resurrection. They typically will say something like Jesus only appeared to be resurrected. Now, this is a classic Gnostic heresy, but you can see the idea. If the truth is impermanence, then it makes no sense for Jesus to be resurrected. And then we get these spiritual interpretations of the resurrection. But that's not Christianity. Christianity is the bold and audacious hope that, in fact, there is eternal life. Not pretend, not as a metaphor, but the real thing. And this gets us to difference number 4, suffering and love. You can probably tell that Christianity and Buddhism have different attitudes about suffering. And you can find stories in the Gospels where Jesus shows a lot of compassion for the suffering of other people. And Buddha is said to have compassion for all suffering. So you might think here, finally we have the two in agreement. But no. Where Buddha has built a religion all about avoiding suffering, Jesus demands that you embrace suffering willingly. And if we understand this, we can understand the difference with respect to family. So Buddha teaches that suffering comes from attachment to transitory things, even other people and even yourself. Enlightenment is learning not to be attached to anything whatsoever. And so you start to see that Buddha's path to enlightenment, it's all optimized around a single goal, avoiding suffering by ending any desire or any attachment. So in terms of goals, avoiding suffering is the only goal. There's nothing positive to achieve in the world. The means is ending all attachment and desire. All right, so ending all attachment and desire. Westerners cannot grasp how radical this teaching is. You're probably trying to change it right now. You're probably like, oh, he means the bad desires. No, he means any desire that would bring you to hold on to anything. So think back to what Jesus said about the husband cleaving to the wife. That's the type of love. That's the type of attachment that creates a bond. Family bonds are a form of attachment. Think about it. Attachment and bond, they mean the same thing. So yes, family bonds are a hindrance to enlightenment on a Buddhist understanding. Jesus is all about attachment. He's all about love. Where Buddha tries to escape the world, in Christianity, God enters the world out of love to save it. Love seeks union. That's as deep an attachment as there is. Remember, Jesus approves of the man cleaving to the wife and the two becoming one flesh. That's attachment. Cleaving is attachment. Love is attachment. Think of the most famous Bible passage. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believeth in him should not perish, but get eternal life. So in Christianity, love drives God to enter the world and unite with it. Now, love and attachment does bring suffering, but Jesus encourages us to take it on. Think about the temptation in the wilderness, or even the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying and he's sweating blood. Clearly, avoiding suffering is not the highest goal. Jesus takes on suffering for the sake of love. I mean, have you heard of the cross? That's not avoiding suffering, that's welcoming it for love. Detachment doesn't motivate you to embrace suffering on the cross. Attachment does. Deep, passionate love for those he's going to save. And so what do spiritual movements like Buddhism do when they encounter Christianity? They deny the suffering. They'll say that on the cross, he only appeared to suffer. Again, this is a classic Gnostic heresy, and it comes from this Eastern vision of spirituality not being able to mix with Christianity. Now, I know a lot of people have been influenced by Eastern spirituality, and they've tried to work the doctrine of non-attachment in, but ask yourself, if unattachment is part of Christianity, why does God enter the world and become man permanently? That is, there's an empty tomb. Jesus' body is resurrected. Furthermore, why would eternal life be our hope? So in Christianity, suffering is not to be avoided. It's certainly not to be avoided by ceasing to love or ceasing to desire. In Christianity, suffering is to be welcomed and embraced. You're supposed to take up your own cross. And so what's the solution for suffering? Well, we have hope that it has an end. We have hope for eternal life. That's the solution to suffering that Jesus offers. So I think it's actually helpful to think about the sights of the Buddha and think, how would Jesus respond if he saw those sights? So first, think about the old man, wearied by age, approaching death. Does Jesus ever encounter that? Yes, he does. Look in the Gospel of Luke near the beginning. What happens? Well, when Simeon holds little baby Jesus, he's inspired with hope. His salvation is at hand. All right, let's go to the second sight, a man suffering from a crippling disease. What would Jesus do? Well, I think we know. Jesus would heal the man of his affliction. He goes around cleansing lepers and healing paralytics. Look in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. Okay, the third sight, a corpse. How does Jesus respond? Well, in several places in the Gospel, Jesus responds by raising the person from the dead. Lazarus would be one of the more famous examples. Look in Luke chapter 7 and the son of the widow of Nain. Now let's go to the fourth, the wandering renunciate. Buddha goes and follows the wandering renunciate. When Jesus encounters a seeker, what does he say? Well, in Luke chapter 18, he says, "Follow me." So the big picture is, on Buddhism, life is seen as inherently full of suffering. And that may not be wrong. There's something very real there that we need to take seriously. But it seems very clear that Jesus sees the exact same problems, but he responds to them differently. Buddha is going to tell you to seek enlightenment so that impermanence and death no longer bother you. But that's not Jesus' answer. Jesus says, I give you eternal life. And so the response is hope.